Welcome to Don't Retire, Graduate, the podcast that asks you what you want to be when you grow up so you can graduate into retirement with purpose and passion. I'm your host and valedictorian, Eric Brotman, and we have a guest today who's so remarkable that I'm going to do what I don't normally do, which is read a portion of her bio because she's just a sensational human being. Natalie Torres-Haddad is a two-time TEDx speaker. I've only seen one of the talks, but it was spectacular. She's an international award-winning author. She wrote a 2012 book and won all kinds of awards with it. She's a bilingual podcaster, host of Financially Savvy in 20 Minutes, which 20 minutes, that sounds terrific. She's an international keynote speaker. She's an educator. She's been in the Huffington Post, the LA Times, and pretty much everywhere that there's print. And I'm out of time, and the show is over just from the bio. Natalie, welcome to Don't Retire, Graduate.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're going to talk today about language and about the language of financial literacy and how that's so similar to a foreign language and how it can be so daunting for people when they're hearing terms and words that might as well be a foreign language, quite frankly. But before we dive into that, which I know is going to be fascinating, we're going to have some fun with it. Tell us a little bit about you and how you got to be not only a multi-time author, but I know you have a new book coming out, and just how you got so passionate about financial literacy.
Such a big question. I always feel it's not easy to answer, but I think for me, it started early on. And I would say maybe in high school. I have a very similar upbringing, like the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which a lot of people have read, by Robert Kiyosaki. And meaning I grew up in Inglewood, California. And during the time, it's a very different Inglewood now compared to when I grew up there. But this was right before the LA riots, or we call it the LA uprising. And, it's a very extreme poverty, that you see within, blocks of where you live, a very diverse community as well, because it's mostly made up of immigrants. And I'm myself an immigrant refugee. My family fled El Salvador during the Civil War. And I grew up and went to public school there up until fifth grade, and the LA riots happened, and my parents feared, what was going around in our neighborhoods. And so then they moved us into private school, my younger brother and I, and private school. And then all of a sudden we went to really great high school, one of the best for private school as well. And now I heard people have very different languages, very different lifestyles. I'm talking about people that, kids that were my age, but their parents were, CEOs, own major companies. I still remember a friend that her dad owned 12 subways, and this was in the early 90s. And back then, 12 subways was basically just starting out, and it was amazing. And you had, a lot of the people from that school are, Olympians. They definitely come from well-to-do families. And so here's me trying to navigate that, coming. And my dad, I remember he used to drive us every morning and back at least 45 minutes each way. And I'm from LA, and that's just taking the streets to make sure we went to this, fancy private school. And I felt like I became this liaison between what the poor and the rich were dealing with. The way we talk to our parents, the way our parents talk to us is very different. And I always felt lucky that my parents gave us everything we needed, at least the necessities. And then private school was like college tuition. And so, we had very limited funds. So we knew we were in the poor bracket, you can say. But I was fascinated by how many more opportunities the rich had, right? I was fascinated by how you could say, let me back up. The basic human rights that many of us don't have, especially for Black and Brown communities, and especially in cities that have lack of funds, that lack of resources, we don't get those same opportunities. So I thought, how can I bring what I'm learning? And I've had so many parents that were just wonderful with me. They're like, oh, let me teach you about this. Or, how do your parents do that? I'm like, my parents don't have a retirement account, or they don't, or maybe they're starting one, right? And so some of these conversations that I was hearing around their homes, because I was very involved in high school. So, we had after school activities. I'd go home to my parents and talk to them. And I was their translator because my dad didn't speak any English. My mom did speak English. So it was just kind of like, I'm learning these two languages at once, right? I was learning how to translate this English, and because Spanish is also my first language, and then learning what financial literacy is. And back in college, I was a business major. I had 2 degrees in finance, international business, but I still felt like I didn't have enough information on what personal finance looked like. I was usually the only female in my classroom, usually the only person of color. And so I knew that one, representation was lacking. But second, I felt there wasn't enough perspective of where I'm coming from. And yet I thought, there's so many people around me that look like me that just don't have this information, right? And so I immersed myself in books and conferences. And back then, this is, and you know this, before YouTube, before Facebook, you had to pay thousands of dollars to go in person, sometimes out of state, for certain workshops. And I usually would get the same response from people and say, "Oh, you're so young," because I was in my early 20s. They're like, "Oh, I wish my kids were here like you are, learning about certain things that, you know, they were learning in their 50s." And so I always kind of felt like, okay, maybe I'm in the right place, or maybe I'm just crazy because no one here looks like me or sounds like me. But fast forward 10 years, it really did change my life personally and my family, really my community around me. So I think that's kind of the power of the fascination around what financial literacy is, and really understanding how we can apply it to everyday life.
One of the things that we struggle with as professional financial advisors, and struggle may not be the right word considering what you just shared with us about your upbringing. So struggle is the wrong word. Why don't we just say one of the speed bumps we jump over at full speed anyway. But it is being relatable, and it is speaking a language that people can understand, and it is trying to avoid some of the jargon that, really, regardless of your upbringing, there's people with PhDs who know nothing about financial literacy or personal finance because it really isn't taught anywhere. And if they didn't get it at home, and usually they don't get it at home, and if they do, it's what not to do, not what to do. It is definitely a communication hurdle, and one that we have to navigate very carefully so that we're not alienating. Because people, it's like someone who's hard of hearing will nod and smile like they hear you, but they don't, and they don't want to admit that that's a situation. Or we have clients in our office. We used to have deliverables, and we realized the font wasn't big enough, and there were people who really couldn't read it properly, and so now we have reading glasses on our conference tables just in case. Because that's the last thing we want to make someone feel is just nod and smile and this will all go away. So there's so much to learn about that, right? So how do you bridge that, and how do you make something that is, by its very nature, complicated, simple enough without being condescending, but simple enough so that it's relatable?
Yeah, I assume, what you just said, I think it's what, knowing your clients, knowing what you know and how you wish somebody would have presented, like you said, having that font or something. And for me, I think it's the way I've tackled it, and while I still continue to tackle it, is bits and bits of pieces of it, right? So, and that's something I always tell my students, my clients, that when they're starting to learn something new, like I call it the foreign language of financial literacy, is what can you start with one thing today, 20 minutes out of your day, right? And figure out why you're interested in that. And what happens is when you start learning this little bit of this huge evolving language, you get more interested in other concepts, and then also understand. And that's what I always tell, especially I feel like I have a harder time with my younger, you would say younger students. And these are like people that are, recent college graduates, that to be patient with themselves, because, they want to know, what's the fastest way to make money? They want to know what's the best way to save, what's the best way to invest. They basically want to do things opposite of what their parents did. So they're like, what can I do now? And I always tell them, be patient with yourself, because you're also learning as you grow. And your 20s, your 30s are completely different. Your 40s, another chapter, right? And so forth. And so sometimes I remind them, like, focus on what's important to you now, which, 20-year-old could be, career, it could be traveling, it could be, starting a family, whatever it might be. But just figuring out, okay, what can I learn today, whether it's listening to a podcast like yours, or, reading a chapter of a book, taking the time to, now I always tell people beware of some YouTube videos or certain things. I always feel like might be giving you the wrong information. And we know this, there's a lot of bad information out there. But really honing down on some of those basic books that are helpful, and picking the ones that are enjoyable too, because I'm not going to name some books, but you probably read many of them as well. They look like huge, twice the size of a Bible or something. And and if someone were to say, students always ask me, should I read this book? I'm like, yes, but it's not the first one you should start with, because it's overwhelming just looking at that. And when you start reading it, they go into such jargon and literally terms that you just are like, what does this mean? You need another dictionary for it. Yeah. And so I find that important to just say, what can you tackle today? Just what makes it a little bit easier.
So it's like traveling in a foreign country where you really don't know a lot of the language. You know enough to ask for a taxi, to find the bathroom, and maybe your hotel, and not much more. And so you carry a little pocket digest, right? That helps with translation. Or of course, now it's all on your phone. You can do that electronically. Now I'm dating myself. How nice. How do you do that? How do you do that in finance? And by the way, I hate to do two questions at once. It's a podcasting no, but I have to. Your show is not financially literate in 20 minutes. It's financially savvy in 20 minutes. So how long does it take to get literate? If I can't get literate in 20 minutes, then what?
Here's a spoiler alert, people. It's a never-ending process. So you're never just 100% fluent. And for those of us that, have been taught different languages, it's always evolving. One of my family members just moved here a few years ago from El Salvador to Boston, and Boston, they got the accent, right? And he's like, they sound very different than what you sound, right? Right? Yeah, I can't. My husband does a better accent than I do, and I said, well, yeah, and he's like, but on top of that, he listens to us that are from California. And he's like, what is fade? What is, and I go, oh, they're shortening the words. So, and he knows proper English, because what you learn back in school, or whatever you want to call proper English. So
yeah, no, proper American is not proper English.
Exactly. It's not proper American English. Right?
Yeah.
So it's the same thing with your finances. And it's funny when you said the pocketbook, because yes, you outdate our age, but my very first, give you a backstory of my very first book that I did write. It wasn't meant to be an actual big book. It was just meant to be, I started writing it as a regular book, and then I would ask my friends for advice, and I'm like, they're not going to read this, because I tell them to read all these amazing other books from great authors, and they wouldn't do it. So I said around Christmas time, I'm like, what if I give them a little pocket book? And it was just that I wanted them to have, those yellow Cliff Notes books that everyone would have back in high school.
Oh, not me. No, never.
Right?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, we didn't cheat. No. But I always actually loved the Cliff Notes, because I want to make sure I understood I was reading, especially as another language. Sometimes you're just kind of like, oh, I thought this is, I took it very differently. So with my first book, it was that I broke down some of the things where I'm like, these are the 5 top things I think you should know. These are the things that and it was catered for people that are just graduated from college. So I was so sick of hearing, and back then there wasn't as many books on this, on especially financial experts and professionals telling people my age, millennials or whatever group you are in, it's your fault that you're in so much debt, or you're eventually going to pay it off. And then these are people that hadn't been in college in at least over 10 years. They don't have 6-figure debt graduating from universities, because the tuition is completely different now as it was back then. And many of us that are first generation had no choice but to take out a loan in order to finish within the certain amount of time. Because I often got that they're like, oh, just, pay as you go and, work full time, which I did as well. But it was impossible to catch up with my other counterparts who didn't have to work full time and go to school full time and still take out a loan, because we didn't have help from our family, or somehow maybe we didn't meet the criteria. Especially for a lot of non-documented students, that's the reality, where it's like you can't get the funds that other people have access to.
I saw recently scrolling somewhere on social media, some kind of meme that said people say we're in the same boat. We're not in the same boat. We're in the same storm. And I thought that was incredibly simple, but also incredibly profound. The storm is the same. Our ability to weather those storms, whether it's recession or gas prices or inflation or job loss or any other event really does depend on the boat you're in. And a lot of that has to do with resources, with education, with that safety net that, to your point, some communities and some families have and others simply do not. And I think a good portion of the United States is one missed paycheck away from real trouble. And that's a scary place to be. That means you can't afford to get sick. You can't afford to get hurt. You can't afford to miss a deadline and I think and being on the razor's edge of that has to be an incredibly anxiety producing thing. And then let's throw in a global pandemic and some economic crisis and just for fun, some political discourse that's as unfriendly as any we've ever seen. And let's throw all this stuff together and see if we can all be on the right anxiety meds. And I feel for those people who don't have those resources. And I think you're creating some of those resources. And one person can only do so much. But I think you're starting to build an influence over specific communities that really has a chance to make a difference and reach the masses. Did you set out to do that, or was that an accident? I mean, you're doing it. Yeah.
First, thank you for that question. It's a long side because there's a lot of hopefulness with it and a lot of frustration that I've had to endure. And what I mean by that is, even just, I actually have this conversation often. Within the last 5 years, I started to see more people, especially Black and brown people in the finance space, which is awesome. Latinos, or Latinx are within an even smaller group. And honestly, when I had just started, this was like back in 2011, when I started going to universities across the country and talking, and I was always the first. They've never seen that before. And it sounds cool being the first, but it also is not for many reasons because, racism is big, right? And not just that, but it's also just trying to navigate, all right, what makes me feel safe? What makes me feel heard? What makes me feel that I'm valid? And just even before, right during the pandemic, I'm not going to mention conferences, we're being called out on the lack of representation and equality within the speakers, within the audience. And I had brought that up early on with a group of other people that were similar background. And it was almost dismissed until it was through social media. People were publicly talking about their experience that they decided to switch and change. And so it comes back to what my grandma would teach my mom and I. My mom's the same way, where, my mom would say, if you don't see the representation of yourself or you don't see anyone that looks like you where you are, you're still there. It just means that you're going to be that example for other people. And I feel like that weighs a lot of responsibility, but it's needed. And for me, I can't tell you how many times I found myself crying in the bathroom when I was, about to graduate from college and then grad school, calling my husband a few times when I was traveling throughout the country, and speaking to extremely smart, PhDs, doctors. And, I was like, oh, here they see me. And, maybe they had just said some comments that had nothing to do with my content, but, I look like I'm Latina because I am, right? And so the stereotypical type. And I'd call my husband and he'd be like, look, you're not there to teach him about life. You're there to teach him about something you're an expert in. And I think that's something that gave me the confidence to be like, you're right. I'm just going to tell them based on what I've done on my own and with people that I've worked with. And at the end of the day, it's, and this is for anyone, any of your listeners, like, I'm sure they're kind of feeling that way. They're like, oh, maybe I'm not good with money or never will be, or maybe my industry just doesn't have, my outlook or whatever it might be. One, you belong to be there no matter where it is. But I hope they tell themselves the way I told myself was, I'm just here to try to figure out what works for me. And hopefully that will trickle down to my family, my friends, my community. And it really does take this, I'm gonna get emotional, but it takes on this life of its own that you didn't expect. The TEDx talk, I never would have expected that. I would have never expected the books. I would have never expected the podcast and just everything that's evolved from it. And have always been a person that I love being behind the scenes. So when I started being hired for doing campaigns and commercials, this is something I wish I would have seen growing up. And I still remember all my professors were all white male. I had some really great professors, and I also had some really horrible ones that were usually just because they were racist. And looking back, I'm like, I was just a kid trying to navigate, and I always felt I lacked of, like I wasn't enough. And so I was always trying to compete with someone that had, 10 steps ahead of me. And I'm like, yeah, I'm barely on step one. And a lot of people feel that about their money. They're like, oh, I'm competing with, actually, I just had a client last week that told me that she paid $40,000 right before the pandemic. She had this chunk of money that she wanted to use for a deposit on something, a property. But the pandemic hit and she lost her job. And so she used the majority of her funds to pay for her rent, living expenses. And she almost felt like she is starting all over again. And I said, well, first of all, you're not homeless, right? And congrats on saving that much. You could do it again. But I understand where she was saying that she goes, here I am. When I thought I've made it, now I have to start again. So my point is that I think all of us just, when we start something new, and you'd probably have this when you're talking to different clients, because everyone has different needs, it's just kind of figuring out what works for you, why you keep doing it. At the end of the day, I keep doing it for my family. I keep doing it for, not necessarily that my family will reap from it, but that my family feels represented and feel heard. And there's a saying in Spanish my grandma would always say, and it's in English, it's you are your ancestors' wildest dreams. Tú eres los sueños realizados de tus antepasados. And it's really hard to believe that when you don't feel like you have much or you're in debt. When I think about that, I'm like, she's right. I'm healthy. I have my health when I sometimes do. And so those are the things that I think about that really make the difference. And I'm sure a lot of people feel that way when they're starting something new.
When I watched your TED Talk, I wrote that down, among other things. I was taking notes. First of all, it's brilliant, and we'll make sure that the talk link is in the show notes, because it's 10 minutes really, really well spent.
Thank you.
You talked about race, you talked about socioeconomics, you talked about age. We haven't talked about gender at all, and I don't think when we start talking financial literacy, our industry is 88% male. Still. And it's an interesting thing. I have a daughter who happens to be fabulous at math, despite the fact that girls are still raised to believe they're not, which is bizarre. Like, why in the world would anyone be told, oh, you're not going to be good at this because of something like that? And it's frustrating. And of course, it's not true. There's no basis for it, other than a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell people enough, that they're going to start to believe it, right? So there are organizations that are out trying to change the demographics of our industry. And by the way, I think there's progress. I don't think it's everywhere, but I think it's there. And I think there's awareness, which is the first step. There's no path into this business. There's no, you can't just go get an accounting degree and sit for your CPA and work for an accounting firm, or go past the bar and be a lawyer. To get into this industry is extremely challenging, because there's no path, there's no roadmap. There's lots of ways to do it, and most of them are generated by who do you know, which is then again a self-fulfilling prophecy if those are the people you know. So I don't want to belabor this point, other than to say that for a woman to be speaking to an audience about finances, she has a hurdle to overcome before she opens her mouth. And I'm sure that's not the only hurdle. So you've got a half a dozen of them. So you're basically running the 100 meter.
Tiring.
And to be, well, yeah, and to be taken seriously. And this business is white and male and old. And I'm at least two of those three things, Natalie. I'm hoping I'm not all three of those things yet, although I'm on my way. And I think it's very important to recognize that the demographics of the business has to change, because the demographics of the consumer, of the company, of the world is also changing. And that's not to suggest that people will only relate to people like themselves. That is simply not true. but it doesn't hurt to have representation and diverse opinions and backgrounds in lots of different ways. And so, we're certainly trying to hire that way, and not on purpose, by the way. We don't have a hiring plan at our firm that says we want this specific demographic. We're finding great people, and it's a diverse group because great people are all different types of people. So I think it's changing. I do. Maybe I'm naive. Am I naive? Tell me the truth. Am I naive?
No,
Am I missing it? Or is this?
I agree. I'm an optimistic too. I agree. I think there's been progress. I mean, I look at the way things have changed as far as access, right? Not just through social media, right? But it's that we are seeing more representation. Yes, they're still lacking, but the point on like the gender side, I think I actually had this conversation with another podcaster where I told him I was raised like a boy, and he was like, "What do you mean by that?" And I go, "Well, I'm my dad. I'm the oldest, and it's just my brother and my younger brother, and my dad." Very much ingrained in my mom as well. They were both feminists before they knew what that meant. And my dad would always say, I expect you to have your education, your own home, travel, and maybe accomplish a few dreams if you decide to settle down. It wasn't, oh, I hope you get married. And I know a lot of women, a lot of girls hear that message at home, like, oh, marry well, or make sure you marry someone that can take care of you and the family. It was complete opposite in my home. And so for me growing up, I remember I was 15, he was telling me this, and then I kept hearing it over and over. Then I went to college. I'm the first in my family to do that, and all these other things that I was achieving and basically dream come true, all these things. And when I would I still meet women that are well into their 80s, or doesn't matter almost what age they are, they never heard that message. And so for me, I always assumed it was just going to happen, all these things. And so I think when society starts to teach our girls, our women, the same way of thinking, that they can do anything, that they can dabble. And I think women are really hard on themselves as well, because we're already told we're not good enough, or we're not going to get paid enough. And we talk about income wage bracket, right? And how if you even break it down by ethnicity, still Latinx are the lowest paid. I believe it's 57 cents to a dollar compared to a white male counterpart. And so the fact that we know we have to work just as hard, and to be seen as an equal, right? And I think I believe we're in the right direction. I believe there's a lot more allies, but I think there's still a lot more work to be done, because what I see often happen when you do see these trailblazers, when you do see some representation, they get burnt out. I definitely know how that feels. And we quit, or we have to pivot, or we have to do something else because it's just too hard. And the beautiful thing is, now looking back now I see a bunch of like financial literacy influencers, you want to call them, that are much younger than me, and they're doing so much better, and they're just doing well. And a lot of them reached out to me before they started, like, how do I do this? And it feels so good to know that I've helped them with it. And they didn't have to go through that, like you said, same struggles that we're just trying to figure out when we're changing the game. And I think about that. And I was lucky. My mom she wasn't an executive always. Her story is incredible, but she was basically that, from the housekeeper in a hotel, because when they came here, that's all they thought that she could do. Luckily, she spoke English as well, and moved up the ranks, got into accounting, got into HR, has been a executive for almost 2 decades now, which is really unheard of, always being the only woman. And I saw that positive role model in my life. And so when I talk to men and women, I'm like, all of you can definitely become better with your money. Don't listen to the stereotypes. And also I come from a culture that's very machismo, specifically Latino, Black and Brown communities is very machismo. And so teaching to rewire ourselves and be like, no, we deserve to be equals, to have, be good partners. And if we're not good with money, it's not necessarily completely our fault. It's just we have to learn this new way of thinking. And it takes time. And that as we get older, it's more of a challenge, but it's doable.
Well, I love your optimism. We talked about your TED Talk. Your TED Talk was 5 steps. And in the end, it was 5 steps to determine that you're going to be okay. And I don't want to spoil them, because I want our listeners to go, and I want our viewers to go watch this. But one of them, one of the steps, the last step, is the one I want to focus on, which is be patient with yourself. There's so much wisdom in
Yes.
this talk, truly so much wisdom in this. And particularly younger generations have gotten very accustomed to instant access. Children today will never have to know what it is to do dial-up internet and wait 7 minutes just to connect. If it takes 3 seconds, they're hitting the side of the computer because something's wrong. Our access to information, they'll never have to go to a library to research something. They can do it in their pajamas. It's instant gratification. You don't even have to wait for the commercial to end to continue your show. You know what I mean? Like, there is no patience anywhere, not on the highways. And I don't have to tell you that, being in LA. There's no patience on the highways. There's no patience in a line anywhere. There's no patience online. There's no patience on hold. And so being patient with yourself, giving yourself some grace, that you're not going to, snap your fingers and suddenly be an expert at this any more than you would be at building a bridge. I think it's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think being patient with yourself is so extremely difficult, and especially for our youth. Like, I really think about, this is why they deal with so much anxiety, and mental health is a real big topic right now, because they're been conditioned since they're babies to look at tablets. There's so many distractions that anxiety is a whole different level, and so trying to figure something out on your own and having the patience to do that is almost non-existent, right? And so you're right. That was the last tip I had included in my talk, was because I think, one, I'm a big advocate for mental health, because, like I said, you can't have one without the other. You can't have financial health and mental wealth. If one of them's off, the other one's going to suffer as well. And because I've personally experienced on both ends, right? And what I think about as adults as well, we don't want to make mistakes, because we know what type of consequences can happen, right? That it not just affect us, it can affect our families, right? But I agree that when we start to just maybe remind ourselves, like, I'm learning, or, that was a mistake, but that mistake isn't regretful, it's just, I learned from it. And I always tell students that, I say, the first place that I bought that was a rental property, God, I think I made the most mistakes in that. And that could have easily told me never buy another property again. But I'm so glad I went through all that, because it made investing a little bit easier. Not always, it just depends on the property, but it allowed me to not repeat some of those mistakes. And it also allowed me to just kind of figure out what I'm comfortable with, right? And I think when we figure out what type of patience we're looking for, especially when it comes to learning about financial literacy, is what makes me feel comfortable. That's why I always say 20 minutes out of your day, because that's how you're learning a language. Usually you take 20 minutes every day to practice some new terms, some new phrases, incorporate them in your language. And I think it goes the same with money. I don't expect someone to be sitting down for a whole hour and do just, look at personal statements and just do accounting, because why would they want to do that every day, especially if they're not interested or don't know much about it yet? And so patience is huge, because we're so hard on ourselves. We come from a generation where we've seen how much our parents have struggled. We see how many people are struggling now, that we don't want to repeat that. And we think, well, if we fix the problem now, we won't have to encounter future mistakes later on. But we all know with age and wisdom how it works. And usually we're learning more from our mistakes, as opposed to when everything goes well. And it's funny, because when things happen so easily, you expect it to always be that way. And I felt from the beginning in high school, I felt like I was this liaison. Some of my wealthy friends had no clue how hard it was for others that, had to take care of and contribute to the family monthly expenses and go to school full time while working. And then I also thought about those that were poor. They had no idea on certain things that they were making harder for themselves, because no one had taught them the easier route, right? Or, things that they could, like my mentors always say, work smarter, not harder. And so those little things, I think, both areas are lacking. And so it's kind of interesting being a translator your whole life, not just to your parents, but to the rest of the world now, when it comes to, they're like, what does this mean? And I go, let me break it down how I see it, and then apply it to yours. And I always find it interesting when people are like, can you explain generational wealth? Can you explain how this affects me? And so I'm fascinated by economy, just the way economy works here and other countries, and what we can take from the best from each, and hopefully not keep repeating the same mistakes.
Well, we are woefully almost out of time. I will tell you that I expect you'll be at FinCon. I expect that if you are, you're not going. All right. Well, the next time we get a chance, time we get a chance, I want to spend more time with you. I could talk to you for a week and a half. But I do need to ask you, it's very important, particularly since you work with young people and everything else. What do you want to be when you grow up? Everybody gets asked that until they're, when they're kids. We never ask adults. So what do you want to be when you grow up? What's next?
Oh, for me I want to be a community game changer, and still within the realms of finance. And I know that sounds kind of lame, but for me, it's like, I love dance, I love art, and I feel like there still lacks a lot of that within the content that we create. And I have so much fun with incorporating things like that. So for me, it doesn't exist, you could say, as that type of job, but I'm creating it as I go. And I think that's kind of the things I've always wanted to do, and I'm still trying to figure it out how to navigate that.
Well, you're ahead of the curve already, and I can't thank you enough for spending time with us today. I do need an extra credit assignment from you, and I'm going to assign one too, and it might even be the same one, but you're first. No pressure at all. What's the extra credit assignment today for our listeners? What can they do today to be better, either from a personal financial literacy or financial independence standpoint?
Yeah, I kept on drilling, take 20 minutes out of your day. So I'm going to stick a little bit with that. But I want everybody that's listening today is just take one thing that you want to accomplish before the end of the year. I know we're like almost there, a few months away. And write it out somewhere that you're going to see it every single day. So then when you're taking 20 minutes every single day to learn something about financial literacy, it's because you're reminded, oh, it's because I want to buy that house. So it's because I want to take my family on this trip. I feel like our goals are much more attainable when it's something fun, as opposed to saying, oh, I want to be out of debt, or I want to be, I want to have a better credit limit. It's not as exciting, right? So write something, at least that one goal that by the end of 2022, you can accomplish. And those 20 minutes out of your day is because you're working towards that.
Well, I think that's sage advice, and I'm going to piggyback on that. And I'm going to say everyone should not only take the 20 minutes, but the first 10 should be watching your TED Talk. So I will make sure that that's in the notes. It is really, really wonderful. Natalie, it's been fun. I could talk to you all day. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your gravitas, and your sense of humor. And, I hope we'll stay in touch for sure.
Oh, I'm sure we will. Thank you so much for having me. Can't wait. And yes, I'll see you hopefully soon in person.
Sounds great. I'd like to thank all of you for listening and for watching this week. Don't Retire, Graduate comes to you every Thursday. Next week, we'll have another office hours. In 2 weeks, we'll have another engaging guest. For now, just remember, don't retire, graduate. This is your host, Eric Brotman. I'll see you next week.
Securities offered through Kestra Investment Services, LLC, Kestra IS, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Kestra Advisory Services, LLC, Kestra AS, an affiliate of Kestra IS. Kestra IS or Kestra AS are not affiliated with Brotman Financial or any other entity discussed.